Star Wars 7x7, episode 2967. We're going to get just a bit spoilery about The Princess and the Scoundrel, the new novel by Beth Revis, over the next couple of days. Today we're going to focus on Leia and some things we learn about her through the course of the book. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So one of the things that we talked about in the review of The Princess and the Scoundrel earlier this week is that the book dives deeply into the minds of its primary characters, Leia and Han. We learn a lot about the way that they're thinking at this moment in time. Their reflections are just incredible. The stuff that they are mulling over, their self-awareness about these things, like just really terrific, tremendous. It's one of the best parts of the book. So today we're going to talk about a couple of notable things that are happening with Leia in the course of the book. This is by no means a definitive list, and it's not necessarily even the most important stuff. It's just the stuff that particularly jumped out at me that I thought was especially worth noting. I think for Leia, at the top of the list has to be her relationship with the Force as it is explored in this novel. Now, you'll recall from The Rise of Skywalker that there is some moment of time where Luke is providing Jedi training to Leia until she ultimately cuts off that training. We don't get to see Leia training in the Force in this book. However, Luke presents her with the possibility, and she is mulling it over very carefully. The problem with that is her experience of the Force comes not only from Luke, but also from Darth Vader, who she cannot reconcile as Anakin Skywalker. She can't reconcile the possibility of him having any good in him or having become good at the end. She just knows him as the horror that he was. But she does eventually arrive at the point where she says, I'm not going to let him take the Force away from me. Like, if I have this power, then I'm not going to avoid it just because he became evil with it. Although, crazily enough, there is a point in the book where Leia muses about the idea of what's the use of having this power if you can't save the ones you love, which is, of course, a very Anakin, oh, hello, senior producer Indy, jumping on the desk here. That's a very Anakin Skywalker, Padme turning to the dark side of the Force kind of thing to be thinking. And if you're watching the YouTube version of this, here's the chunky senior producer on camera. So the situation with Leia and the Force, of course, you might expect that she has a situation where she would love to call on the Force. She doesn't necessarily know how to call on the Force, but is she going to have to figure out how to call on the Force? Yeah, it probably will not come as a surprise considering all the conversation that happens about the Force and whether she can connect with it throughout the course of the book. Another thing that's especially notable about Leia as we go through the course of The Princess and the Scoundrel is that her workaholic ethic is reinforced on multiple occasions. So this whole Halcyon trip is partly a honeymoon, but it's also meant to be sort of a public relations stunt for all intents and purposes. If the rebellion has time for two of its most visible leaders to go on a honeymoon, then gee whiz, maybe something good is happening in the galaxy. But not only that, in discussions with Mon Mothma, some of the hope for this involves diplomatic stops along the way. So where the Halcyon can be directed to a planet that might have fuel resources, can Leia make contact with the people that she needs to make contact with to start building a relationship that will involve guaranteeing fuel resources for the burgeoning New Republic? And naturally that causes its share of friction between Leia and Han during their honeymoon too. So there's that for conflict and banter and whatnot. It also ties into Star Wars Uprising, which we've mentioned on the podcast from time to time. That is the now defunct mobile game that had been put out a few years ago. There have been a lot of references to the stuff that happens in that game in various Star Wars media since then. And I do hope they just have an official telling of all the story that happened in Uprising in some other media that's accessible. But right now, like, that's a part of Star Wars canon storytelling right now that's almost essentially lost to us. But I digress slightly. So another thing to consider is that Leia has been such a public face for the war effort for so long that when she goes to the Halcyon, she becomes a very public center of attention throughout the course of their journey. And she is subject to confrontations and congratulations and overhears things both good and bad. And she also reflects on news media and how she's portrayed and covered and what you see on the holonet and that sort of thing. So propaganda and people's reactions to her are also a big part of The Princess and the Scoundrel. A fourth thing I'll mention is how Leia is ruminating about family and what that means. So I kind of touched on this a little bit in talking about the Force-related stuff and her reflections on Vader, whether she can feel him as her father or whether she wants anything to do with him at all. There's also reflections about the fact that Luke had an aunt and an uncle, and she wonders whether they were her aunt and uncle as well. I guess Luke never particularly discussed that one way or the other. And I guess technically they kind of are because, well, not by blood, but by marriage, basically. So Owen Lars is Anakin's stepbrother, I believe. And so that would mean that Luke and Leia are the step-niece and nephew of Owen and Beru. So yeah, I guess technically Leia really is related to them. But of course she's thinking mostly about Breha and Bail, about how she wishes that they were there for her wedding to Han, and yet the Force comes into play in a very fun way regarding that as well. Ultimately, Leia's thoughts in this are very much of a found family kind of way of thinking. And the last thing I'll mention is that there is a scene where Leia and Han are having a quiet moment and Leia says, hey, I met Kira. And Han kind of sits up a little bit and is like, what, my Kira? And she kind of gives him a look and he's like, you know what I mean? And she ends up telling Han the story that Kira told her, which actually relates to War of the Bounty Hunters, and that particular meeting, I think it was War of the Bounty Hunters that happened in. And I just happen to think that was a particularly amusing scene too. So that's what I thought might be fun to share about Leia in The Princess and the Scoundrel. And there's, of course, a whole host of other interesting things that she thinks about that happen with her. And I encourage you to check out the novel if that's your thing. And that right there is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it as always. And may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.